Every single president in modern American history enters office at the peak of their power and leaves weaker than they started, not because they failed, not because voters turned on them personally, because the system is built to do this to them. Every one of them, every party, every era. Today, I want to show you exactly how that happens. The four structural forces that quietly drain power out of the most powerful office in the world on a schedule, whether the person sitting in it is doing a good job or not. This is not a story about any one president. I want to be precise about that up front, because it's tempting to hear a title like this and immediately think of whoever is currently in office. That's exactly the wrong way to watch this video. This is a pattern that shows up under Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, popular presidents and unpopular ones, presidents who governed brilliantly and presidents who didn't. If it happens to all of them, it isn't really about any of them. It's about the structure of the office itself. Here's what we're covering. Four forces, each one operating on its own clock, each one independent of who the president actually is. Force one, the electoral clock. Why the president's party almost always loses ground in Congress on a predictable schedule, regardless of performance. Force two, the persuasion problem. Why a president's real power was never the power to command. It was always the power to persuade people who have their own careers to protect. Force three, the calendar problem. What actually happens to a president's leverage the moment everyone around them realizes they won't be on the ballot again. Force four, the institutional memory problem. Why the people surrounding a president change constantly and what that turnover actually costs. Four forces. Let's start with the one that's easiest to see coming because it's written into the calendar itself. Here is one of the most consistent patterns in American electoral history. In nearly every midterm election since the 1940s, the president's party has lost seats in the House of Representatives. Only two exceptions. 1998, during Bill Clinton's second term, in the middle of the Lewinsky scandal and impeachment fight, his party gained seats anyway. In 2002, under George W. Bush, in the aftermath of September 11th, when his party gained seats during an unusual moment of national unity. Notice what those two exceptions have in common. They're both moments when something entirely outside normal political competition scrambled the usual dynamic. Absent an event like that, the pattern holds almost every single time. There's a popular idea called the 6-year itch, the theory that second-term midterms, the 6th year of a 2-term presidency, are especially brutal for the president's party. That turns out to be true in the Senate. 6th-year Senate losses do tend to run worse than first midterm losses, but in the House specifically, the data doesn't actually support a special 6th-year effect. First midterm and 6th-year House losses are nearly identical historically. Why does any of this happen with such consistency? Because a midterm election is structurally a referendum on whoever holds the White House, and referendums on incumbents almost always attract more energized opposition turnout than the winning side supporters who feel less urgency 2 years after their candidate already won. That's not a comment on any specific administration's performance. It's a comment on how human motivation works inside a fixed electoral calendar that repeats every single cycle for every single president on schedule. Think about what this actually means in practice in the room where legislation gets negotiated. A president walking into year 2 of a term is negotiating with a Congress that already knows an election is coming in a matter of months, an election that will very likely shrink his working majority, regardless of anything he does between now and then. That knowledge changes behavior on both sides of every negotiating table in Washington months before a single vote is ever cast. And once those seats are actually lost, the effect compounds. A president who started with a comfortable majority in the House now has to win over members who owe him nothing, who may actively want him to fail so their own party looks better heading into the next presidential race. The same legislative agenda that passed easily in year 1 can become nearly impossible in year 3 not because the agenda changed, but because the arithmetic underneath it did. Losing seats in Congress is the visible part of this story, the part that makes headlines. But the deeper mechanism, the one that actually explains why those lost seats matter so much, has almost nothing to do with vote counts at all. In 1960, a political scientist named Richard Neustadt published a book that changed how an entire generation of scholars and White House staffers understood the presidency. His central argument was almost counterintuitive. The president's real power was never the power to command, it was the power to persuade. Think about why that's true constitutionally. The president cannot pass a law. The president cannot appropriate money. The president cannot, on his own, do almost anything that requires another branch's cooperation, and nearly everything requires another branch's cooperation. What the president actually has is leverage, the ability to make other political actors believe that cooperating with him serves their own interests better than opposing him does. Here's where that framework connects directly to everything we just covered about the electoral clock. That leverage depends entirely on other people believing the president can still help them or hurt them in the future. A member of Congress from the president's own party calculates, will supporting this president help my next campaign or hurt it? Early in a term, after a strong election win, the answer is usually it helps. The president has coattails, momentum, a mandate voters just handed him. But every single one of the dynamics we just discussed, the midterm losses, the shrinking congressional majority, the approval trends that usually drift downward from an initial honeymoon high, steadily changes that calculation for every member of Congress watching. The president's ability to reward loyalty or punish defection erodes. Precisely because his usefulness to other people's careers erodes, this is not weakness in a personal sense. It's a mathematical consequence of a persuasion-based office operating inside a system where everyone else is also thinking about their own next election. Neustadt's framework also explains something that puzzles a lot of casual political observers: why a president can hold historically high approval ratings and still struggle to pass a signature piece of legislation, or, conversely, why an unpopular president can sometimes still push a major bill through. Persuasion power isn't a direct function of national popularity. It's a function of whether the specific people the president needs votes from believe cooperating serves their own interests. National polling is one input into that calculation, but it is never the whole calculation. That distinction matters because it means the erosion we're describing isn't simply the public turned on him. It's narrower and more mechanical than that. The slow accumulation of individual members of Congress, one at a time, concluding that the president can no longer meaningfully help or hurt their own political future. Here's where this becomes almost unavoidable, structurally. The 22nd Amendment caps a president at 2 elected terms, which means every single 2-term president on a fixed and completely predictable date becomes something political scientists call a lame duck, someone who will never again personally stand for election. Watch what happens to Force 2, the persuasion problem. The instant that fact becomes common knowledge in Washington, every member of Congress recalculates. If the president can never again help or hurt my specific re-election campaign, why would I spend my own political capital doing what he wants instead of what I want? This isn't cynicism. It's rational behavior from people who also have careers, also have voters back home, and also have their own incentive to distance themselves from an increasingly unpopular president as their own next election gets closer. And this dynamic compounds sharply under divided government. When the opposing party controls one or both chambers of Congress, a lame duck president loses even the informal leverage that a friendly majority might otherwise extend out of loyalty. Congress has, at multiple points in modern history, formally reasserted itself against a president precisely when that president's leverage was already fading. In 1973, in the middle of Watergate and the winding down Vietnam War, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution over a presidential veto, a direct, formal reclaiming of war-making authority from an executive whose position was collapsing in real time. In 1987, During Ronald Reagan's second term, the Iran-Contra hearings produced a bipartisan committee finding that the National Security Council had run a covert operation without congressional authorization at all. Two different presidents, two different decades. The same underlying pattern. Congress reasserts itself hardest exactly when a president's future leverage has already started to fade. Here's the honest complication. Because I want this framework to be useful, not simplistic. This pattern is real and well documented, but it's not universal. A small handful of presidents, Reagan, Eisenhower, Clinton among them, actually held their approval rating steady into their final year rather than declining. The pattern is a strong tendency, not an iron law. And it's worth noting that lame duck status doesn't only produce weakness, it can also produce a very specific kind of freedom. A president who will never face voters again has nothing left to lose politically in the traditional sense, which is exactly why the final months of a term so often produce a burst of unilateral activity, executive orders, pardons, last-minute regulations, and recurring across administrations of both parties, a concentrated rush of judicial confirmations before an outgoing Senate majority disappears. That's not the office losing all its power. It's the office's remaining power concentrating into the one channel that doesn't require anyone else's continued cooperation. But even the presidents who avoid declining approval still run into the fourth force, and this one has nothing to do with elections, polling, or Congress at all. It's happening inside their own building. Researchers who track White House staffing have found a consistent pattern across decades of administrations. Senior staff and cabinet turnover tends to climb as a term goes on, not fall. Think about what that actually costs an administration. Every departure means a successor has to be recruited, vetted, confirmed in many cases by a Senate that may no longer be especially cooperative, and brought up to speed on ongoing negotiations, relationships, and institutional history that the departing officials simply carried out the door with them. Researchers studying this pattern have explicitly linked higher turnover to governing disruption, slower policy execution, weakened institutional memory, and more friction in an already difficult confirmation process. That's not a proven, laboratory-tested cause and effect, but it's a reasonable, well-supported inference from real, tracked data, and it fits naturally alongside everything else we've covered. So by the time you reach the later years of a term, you have a genuinely compounding problem. A smaller, less loyal congressional majority, colleagues in Congress who no longer believe cooperating helps their own reelection, an inner circle that has partially turned over, taking real experience and institutional relationships out the door with it. First-term data across the last several administrations shows this same acceleration pattern, even though the specific rates differ significantly from one administration to the next, depending on individual circumstances. What stays consistent across nearly every administration tracked is the direction. Turnover is almost always higher in later years than in the first year, never the reverse. That directional consistency, more than any single administration's specific number, is what makes this a structural force rather than a one-off staffing story. Put the four forces together and you get a genuinely compounding effect, not four separate, unrelated problems. A shrinking congressional majority makes persuasion harder. Harder persuasion makes a president lean more on unilateral tools. Reduced legislative wins make a lame duck president even less useful to allies calculating their own future. And a thinning senior staff means fewer people left in the building who remember how to execute complex plays. Each force feeds the next one. Here's why. Understanding this pattern actually changes how you should read the news starting today. When you see a president's approval numbers sliding in year 3 or 4, resist the urge to treat that as a verdict on whether that specific person is doing a good job. It also might just be the predictable operation of a system engineered on purpose to prevent any single office holder from accumulating permanent, unchecked power. 2026 is itself a midterm year, which means every force we just discussed is operating right now in real time, regardless of who occupies the office. Congressional approval overall has been sitting near historic lows this year, and history shows that when Congress's own approval sits this low heading into a midterm, the president's party has typically lost roughly 50 House seats in that election. That's not a prediction about this specific midterm. It's a historical pattern worth knowing so you can watch the actual results whenever they land with real context instead of raw surprise. And this is exactly the kind of moment where most political commentary fails you. You'll hear pundits on every side treat a midterm swing as proof of some sweeping ideological verdict that the country has fundamentally changed its mind about something. Sometimes that's true, but strip away the noise and look at the base rate first. The president's party losing House seats at a midterm is closer to the default outcome than the exception, decade after decade, regardless of ideology. The more interesting analytical question is never, did they lose seats? It's, did they lose more or fewer than the historical pattern would predict? And what does that gap actually tell you? And here's the part that should genuinely reassure you, whichever party you support. This entire structure, the electoral clock, the persuasion problem, the lame duck calendar, the staff turnover exists specifically to prevent one person from consolidating power indefinitely. The framers built fixed terms, and later generations added the 22nd Amendment precisely because permanent, undiluted executive power was the exact thing the American system was designed to avoid. A president who seems to be losing leverage in year 3 isn't a system failing. In the most literal sense, it's a system working. That's an uncomfortable thing to sit with if your preferred president is the one losing ground in a given year, and it's exactly as true on the same schedule whenever the other party holds the office. Instead, every American president operates inside fixed terms, a 2-term limit, and a midterm election that arrives on schedule no matter what. Every other actor in this system, voters, members of Congress, senior staff, is also managing their own career and their own future, and recalculates constantly based on how useful the president still is to that future. Power drains out of the presidency not because any individual fails, but because the system was deliberately built to make permanent power impossible to hold on to. Understanding that difference between a person losing and a system working exactly as designed is what separates reading the news like a spectator from reading it like a strategist. If you want to build this kind of structural thinking into how you read every political story from now on, not who's winning the news cycle, but what the incentives underneath it actually are, that is exactly what I teach inside the coaching program. 3-month and 6-month tracks are open now, linked below. Subscribe if this kind of analysis is useful to you, because we've got a lot more of these institutional patterns to break down before this election year is over. I'm Kent Tran. This is The Political Gentleman. I'll see you in the next one.